Welcome to module number 7, Common Techniques and Risk Specialisms. After completing this module, you will be able to identify the common techniques for each step of the MOR process. If you recollect, we talked about 4 big steps. We identify the risks, we assess the risks, we plan for risk responses, and we implement. And communication is something that we do throughout the 4 processes. And finally, we're going to conclude this module with different types of risk specialism. The risk area that we are discussing today is an area within the context of projects, programs, and portfolios. But then besides these elements, there are also risk specialisms that we would need to explore. So let's kind of move into the common techniques of each of the process. Let me just use the highlighter to take you through each of the techniques. So the table provides details of the techniques listed in each step of the MOR process and the techniques and the associated tools used to support risk management for a particular area should be predefined in the risk management strategy. Remember, when we talked about risk management approach and documents, we talked about a document called a document, a project risk management strategy, or a program risk management strategy, or a portfolio risk management strategy. So these documents should mention the techniques and the associated tools that we're going to use for risk management. Some techniques are also useful in other process steps, and this is indicated in the adjacent column in the table. So let's start off with identify context. Some of the techniques associated with this process include stakeholder analysis. Remember, we talked about mapping the stakeholders based on their interest and influence. We could use an interest influence grid and map the stakeholders onto that particular example. There could be a few stakeholders who are pretty high in interest and high on influence. So how do we really deal with that particular group of stakeholders? What kind of communication strategy should we be using to deal with that stakeholder? So those are all ideas pertaining to stakeholder analysis. Remember, we talked about PESTEL analysis. PESTEL stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. So what is our political landscape? Are there any sources of risk pertaining to changes of government, for example? Are there any changes of risk because of changes in the economic conditions, in the social environment, in the technological landscape? You know, we are moving into very disruptive technology environments, into cloud-based technology environments. Any changes in the legal environments, in a world of constant economic changes. So we kind of are analyzing the landscape in terms of understanding the broad context of the program. And SWOT analysis is another analysis that is relevant to the context step. S stands for strength. W stands for weaknesses. What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses at the project level, at the program level, at the portfolio, strategy, and operational level? And what are our opportunities and what are our threats? We might want to do our analysis. Horizon scanning is scanning the horizon in the next, let's say, 5 or 10 years. What would the environment look like? What would be the political landscape look like? What would be the economic landscape look like? So we kind of are scanning the horizon. And then define the probability impact grid. So this is basically a color-coded matrix that a lot of organizations use in terms of mapping the exposure of a particular risk. On one scale, on one axis of the grid, you would have the probability. On the other axis, you would have the impact. And the risk exposures mapped on a grid, color codes such as red, amber, and green. So good to kind of have a defined probability impact grid in the identify context process. Now, some of these techniques could also be used as a part of identify the risk step. Now, coming down to the next process, we have the identify the risks step. So what tools and techniques are relevant for this particular step? We could use checklists. A checklist would be a set of bullet points that we might want to kind of create to run the stakeholders through when we, let's say, do some identification workshops with the stakeholders. These are predefined documents, and you could kind of create a very well-formulated set of questions or ideas that you would like to run through as a part of the risk workshops. A prompt list is a list which kind of prompts you to choose certain categories. For example, up on the top, remember, we talked about the pestle analysis. We could use this particular list as a prompt to create our risk breakdown structures or our risk categories. And then cause and effect diagrams, also called as Ishikawa diagrams. They are very useful tools. Brainstorming is very useful in gathering ideas on risks. Now, one of the challenges with brainstorming is the fact that if you do not choose the right facilitator, there's often a tendency for those within the group who dominate the conversations might have a lot of say in the meetings, and those who are quiet, would not be able to contribute well. So a good facilitation is important in terms of balancing the ideas that you might want to gather from all those who are present. Nominal group technique is very similar to brainstorming, but it is very structured. Let's say, for example, you have a team of 10 people with whom you are doing a workshop in identifying the risks. You could give each of the participants a post-it note and ask each of the participants to list the top 5 risks pertaining to a particular category. So each of the participants would document the top 5 risks. And then you as a facilitator would kind of pick up the first risk on each of the post-it notes, do a bit of structured thinking around that particular risk, and then you move on to the second one, and so on. It's a structured brainstorming. And then Delphi is a technique wherein you involve subject matter experts, and you do that in an anonymous fashion. Let's say, for example, you would like to understand the risks associated with procurement. So you identified 3 stakeholders from whom you would like to gather ideas. So you might want to send one questionnaire to stakeholder 1, another stakeholder to the other expert, and the third questionnaire to the third expert. And none of the expert knows that you are gathering information from the others. It is anonymously done, and you obtain good information. And the whole idea is to kind of avoid the bias pertaining to group thinking. Oftentimes, when you kind of involve a group, it could be the case that certain of the people involved in the group could be reporting to another person in the group, so they might not tend to open up. So Delphi technique is a good way to get solid feedback from subject matter experts using anonymous techniques. Questionnaires are great ways of soliciting feedback on the risk front. We could use questionnaires on past projects and use them on a current project, or we could create one from the scratch. Individual interviews can fetch pretty good ideas on risk front. The downside of individual interviews is the fact that it does consume a lot of time, and if time is a constraint on your project or program, individual interviews are not usually recommended techniques. Assumptions analysis are basically challenging your beliefs. What is it that we believe? We need to constantly examine them because assumptions, if not validated, can turn out to be risks on your project or programs. What are your limitations? Your limitations could be pertaining to resources. Limitations could be pertaining to certain operating hours. So it's good to kind of know what your limitations are, because that could be a contributor of risk. And good to describe your risk in the cause, event, effect format. Because of an XYZ reason, a risk might occur, which might result in a particular consequence. Example, because of poor weather condition, the machine may malfunction, resulting in a cost overrun or a timeline delay. So good to kind of describe risk in that format. And certain of these techniques are also used in the plan step of the process. Let's move on to the next